Welcome, everyone, to the PFF Fantasy Podcast. I'm John Macri, and I am joined, as always, by PFF's lead fantasy analyst, Nate, the great Jahnke. Nate, we are live for the last time this season on the YouTubes and out into the Twitterverse. This is it. The entire season has been building toward this 1 week fantasy football championship week. Everybody who plays fantasy football is playing to make it to the finals, but unfortunately only two from each league can make it there, and there only one could come away the winner. So how are you feeling heading into finals week this year?
Feeling pretty good. Had some nice matchups. I have an opponent in one league who won by 0.03 points to face me in the fantasy championship round. So that'll be a fun matchup there. But it's a weird week with the games on Wednesday, games on Thursday, games on Saturday. Like, we were having the games on Sunday and there were injury reports coming out for the Wednesday games.
Yes.
And I'm like, this is not supposed to be happening at this time. That's a different time of day and different time of week. But just talking about waiver strategy in general this week, since it's weird, you want to make sure that if you have someone that you're definitely not going to start, your opponent's definitely not going to start, it's perfectly fine to drop those players at this point. It doesn't matter if they've been a starter for you all season. If they're not starting for you, if you don't think your opponent will want them, it's fine to drop them. Go ahead and pick up as many players that could be in your lineup if things go right. Definitely keep an eye on all the injury reports this week. And also, if there's someone you think your opponent might want to be starting, that's someone you want to be picking up, even though you're strong at that position.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm all for this, trying to block your opponent if you need to. And yeah, getting rid of all the players that you're not going to use. I mean, there's just no point in doing it. I mean, it sounds, fairly simple, but a lot of people kind of forget to do it. So it's definitely a key part of this final week here. So make sure you're doing everything you can to win, because we got to get a little bit lucky as well. So we're going to try to give you guys some waiver wire options this week, either players that, again, have the potential to start for you, or maybe your opponent might be looking for, so you could add them to try to block them as well. But you can reference the full list on with Nate's waiver wire article on PFF.com. You could get access to that with a PFF Plus subscription. And then if you guys have questions in the chat as well, we will go through them as we go through each of the position groups and as they make sense. So let's start with our running backs, Nate. And we'll start at the top with Kendre Miller of the New Orleans Saints, who we just watched on Monday Night Football. He did not do much at all, but at least did lead the team in carries, Nate.
Yeah, I still have Miller at the top of the list despite last night's game. We saw that they were at least trying to make him the lead running back. Over the first couple drives, he took 11 of the first 15 snaps, got a number of touches on those drives. And then similarly, to start the second half, they tried to get him the ball. It was 4 consecutive plays where he either ran the ball or caught a pass. So they were trying to get him the ball, but the Saints, injuries across the board. They were down their top several wide receivers, down their quarterback. Still don't have Taysom Hill, so it was really a bunch of backups playing for New Orleans. It was the first shutout of the season by any team, so because the game script wasn't going in the Saints' favor, for whatever reason, they didn't want Miller on the field in those kind of either 2-minute drills or late in the game where they were just passing every single play. So we saw a combination of Jordan Mims and Jamal Williams in those clear passing situations. But anytime it was a normal kind of situation, it was Miller on the field. The Saints just didn't have very many normal situations last night. They are facing the Las Vegas Raiders next week. That should be a closer game. Hopefully, a number of Saints players are able to return that week. A chance Derek Carr can play. A chance Chris Olave can play. A chance Marquez Valdes-Scantling can play. Hopefully, a much better offense than we saw this past day. There's also just the chance that Alvin Kamara could also play, in which case Miller would have no fantasy value. So that is running backs across the board. A lot of these are injury related, so you'll have to keep an eye throughout the week on injuries to figure out which running backs you might want on your roster. But like we were saying at the start of the show, if you think you need a running back, if you think your opponent might need a running back, it would be best to just stockpile as many of these guys that we're talking about as you can.
Absolutely. Yeah. And hopefully the Saints offense would be a little bit better next week. The bar is set very low, so they got to be able to do something. I know they lost an offensive lineman in that game as well. It was just not good. So let's go on to the next running back on the list. And Tony Pollard has been banged up a little bit. He was banged up heading into week 16, which is something we talked about last week, and why Tajay Spears was someone to target, because Pollard's injuries and the Titans season not being reliant on him anymore. This happened again this week. So Tajay Spears is the next man up for us.
Yeah, so he's been the clear running, or he's led the team in snaps each of the last 2 weeks, the only 2 times this season that he's done that. I think both times it was a combination of the game script as well as Pollard's injury, since Pollard was the clear running back to start each of these 2 games. It was just Spears was mixed in, similar to what we saw earlier in the season when both running backs were 100%. But as the game script got more and more out of the Titans' favor, it was Spears on the field more and more often. At least 2 weeks ago, we saw Pollard playing and then clearly not at 100%, clearly like looking like he was injured a couple of times in that game. So I think with the running backs, there is a lot of how much risk you're willing to put in versus how much reward. The reason Spears is this high is because the reward would be very high if Pollard does not play. The Titans playing the Jacksonville Jaguars, the team they just played a couple weeks ago, and Pollard had a huge game. They have no problem giving a running back over 80% of the snaps. And clearly, anytime Pollard and Spears have been the 2 running backs, they've been the only 2 running backs. So I could see Spears playing over 80% of snaps and having a great game against Jacksonville. If the Titans decide to shut down Pollard, which they are a team out of playoff contention, if Pollard isn't at 100%, the closer we get to the end of the season, the more likely they are to shut him down. There is just also a chance that Pollard does play, in which case Pollard would probably lead the team in snaps and Spears wouldn't see much production. So this is a little bit of a higher risk, but because the matchup for the Titans are so good, I have Spears higher on the list because there's a lot of other running backs who could see a lot of playing time. But if you're in the fantasy championship, then chances are you have good running backs and don't necessarily need someone. So this is a situation where you might not need Spears, but Spears might be so good that you want him anyway in a situation where Pollard doesn't end up playing.
Gotcha. Okay, so Tank Bigsby has been a name that we've talked about quite a bit this season, Nate, in large part because he's been eating into Travis Etienne's role, and we saw him lead the team in carries and rushing yards this past week while also scoring a touchdown. So Bigsby could definitely be in fantasy starting lineup consideration as well here heading into week 17.
Yeah, kind of the opposite of Spears, and that Spears, it takes a specific situation for him to have a lot of fantasy value. Bigsby might not have as much upside, but he is the safest running back on the list because he is the only one that is not dependent on injuries to other running backs in the backfield. Bigsby, it's 3 straight games now where he has seen double-digit carries facing the Titans, so the other end of that matchup. And both teams being out of playoff contention should be a relatively close game, I would expect. So a game where both teams should be able to run the ball a decent amount. So I think Bigsby is pretty safe to get double-digit carries this week. So it's a situation where if you need a running back in your starting lineup who can at least get those double-digit carries, then Bigsby is definitely the running back you want. And it's worth noting all 3 of these running backs that we've started with all taken in 45 to 50% of ESPN leagues. So a lot of leagues where these first 3 guys are taken. So while they are the clear 3 top players, there will be plenty of leagues where none of them are available.
For sure. And we do at least have some players that are a little bit more widely available as well. And starting in Arizona, where James Conner, he's been excellent all season, but unfortunately did finally get an injury, which has been a concern with him all year. He's done a great job avoiding it up until now. Not sure the extent of the injury or if he'll miss time, but if he does, then both Trey Benson and Michael Carter may become options for folks in week 17.
Yeah, Trey Benson is someone that we told people to draft at the start of the season because James Conner had that injury history. And if Conner does get hurt, then Benson would have a large role in the offense. The only problem is Benson was inactive for this game because Benson had an injury. So it was Michael Carter, who was elevated off the practice squad, who took over for Conner for the rest of the game. For most of the season, it was Amari DiMercato, who was the 3rd down back. He is on injured reserve, so DJ Dallas is taking over as the 3rd down back. So it's a situation where we see Trey Benson healthy this week and Connor is not healthy, then I would expect Benson to be the lead running back, the running back to see at least double-digit carries going against the Los Angeles Rams, who is a relatively average matchup, but one where Benson would probably rank among the top 24 running backs or so, assuming he's 100% and Connor doesn't play. But if both running backs are not able to play, then I'd expect Michael Carter to be the clear early down and 2-minute drill back, also someone capable of playing on third downs, even though I'd expect Dallas to continue in that role. But Carter, someone who's available in 99.9% of ESPN leagues. So it's hard to tell because we don't know the health of both of the top two running backs. So it's hard to make a definitive decision right now, but it's one where someone could be a clear fantasy starter this week. And It's a game that is played on Saturday, so you should likely know who is starting in that game before having to make too difficult of decisions. So that's also something to keep in mind this week as well. When games are happening, that could also impact who you trust and who you don't trust. So we should have a Cardinals injury report later today. So definitely wait to make your waiver bids until later today when we have injury reports for six of the games, all of the games, Wednesday, Thursday, and Saturday. So we're used to only having one injury report on this day. Today we have a lot more injury information than we usually have.
Yeah, that should be fun. And I mean, even at the very least, like there's a chance that, your opponent has James Conner as well that you're playing in the final. So again, speculative ad there to kind of block the potential backups if Conner is missing here. So yeah, looking at Trey Benson and Michael Carter for sure. Okay, off to Vegas next, Nate, where we lost the good Raiders running back Sincere McCormick to IR. So it's up to Alexander Mattison and Amir Abdullah to carry the load. Both of them did fall into the end zone this week, so that could happen again in week 17 if anyone needs to rely on them.
Yeah, this is kind of similar to the Tank Bigsby situation where we at least know who's going to be playing. We at least know that it is a clear two-man rotation. So not the ideal situation for fantasy purposes, but at least one that could be relied on if you are definitely in need of a running back. We saw Madison lead the rotation between the two. This was not a rotation by every single drive, but kind of a rotation by every few drives. We saw Madison take a few drives, then Abdullah take a few drives, and kind of go back and forth where one running back would be the clear lead running back playing at least 80% of snaps over a time period, and then that just kind of flipping back and forth. Abdullah had the better fantasy matchup or fantasy performance this past week, ended up with more yards per carry, so more rushing yards, also had more receptions, even though Madison led the team in playing time. For me, that kind of points to Madison being the better fantasy option of the two, but we have also seen this Raiders team willing to change the running back rotation several times throughout the year based on who is playing better. So there is also certainly a chance that Amir Abdullah gets the start this week, and it's Abdullah leading the two-man rotation. But I think at the very least, it will remain a rotation. I don't see either of these running backs getting over 70% of snaps. So Madison is taken in the almost 50% of leagues where Abdullah is a bit more available. So Abdullah is probably the safest option among those available in at least 60% of leagues, but probably not someone I want starting in my fantasy championship game.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, let's go on to Patrick Taylor of the San Francisco 49ers. They've had so many injuries at the position. Obviously, he was a popular pickup this past week, I know, but as we go further down the 49ers depth chart, it's understandable that he's also kind of further down the waiver target list as well. Just put up 24 yards on 8 carries in week 16, but the snaps are definitely there now at least.
Yeah, the good news is that he was the clear lead running back. He had the exact same role that we saw Guerrero have recently, the exact same role that Mason had for a lot of points this season, where he was the clear every down back, just taking a couple plays off on early downs. In this case, it was for Deebo Samuel, and then also taking some of the third downs off for Kyle Juszczyk, their fullback. So Taylor was the clear running back. It wasn't any kind of rotation. It wasn't anyone else on the depth chart seeing snaps. The only reason he is this low is because the 49ers are playing the Detroit Lions this week, a team where they are likely to fall behind and fall behind early, in which case they probably won't be running the ball a lot. Even though Taylor was on the field a lot this week, they weren't running as much as usual, likely because they trusted their passing game options more than they trusted Taylor in the backfield. So even though I think Taylor will be on the field a ton, I just don't think he's going to see a lot of touches this week. So, and there's also the concern that maybe they get someone else involved, even though they didn't get anyone else involved in this game. But now that they're out of playoff contention, just playing for next year, there's a chance they might want to see one of their other running backs.
Yeah, or just give a bunch of handoffs to Deebo Samuel again as well. Okay, Nate, you've listed Kenny McIntosh of the Seattle Seahawks up next because we saw Kenneth Walker get banged up, and he's been dealing with injuries coming into this week. Meanwhile, Captain Charbonnet has also been a little banged up, so there's a chance we see a little bit more McIntosh usage in Week 17.
Yeah, like I was saying before with the injury reports, we saw last week both Walker and Charbonnet show up on the injury report to start the week. Charbonnet was the starter was the captain for the team this week, didn't touch the ball at all in the first half. Kenny McIntosh actually touched the ball before Charbonnet, and it was clear Charbonnet wasn't 100% because McIntosh was the backup on early downs. Usually that is Charbonnet's role, so McIntosh seeing more playing time than usual, and Kenneth Walker dealing with an ankle injury. We saw the first practice report for them of the week yesterday. Walker did not participate in practice. Charbonnet was a limited participant in practice with the elbow injury. I'm probably only trusting McIntosh in my starting lineup if both Walker and Charbonnet don't play. So probably a small chance that McIntosh ends up being the starter. But if he is, a favorable matchup against the Chicago Bears. So if I were to know for sure that Walker and Charbonnet were not playing, McIntosh would probably be second on this list, depending on the injuries to other teams. It's just a case where he needs two running backs to not play. So I think he is kind of the perfect player to just stash on your roster, not expecting much, not planning on him being your fantasy starter, but there's a chance that things go really well. So he is the kind of perfect pickup specifically for this kind of week.
Yeah, there you go. So buy into some McIntosh stock while the price is low here. Let's go to the last running back name on the list out of Denver. It is rookie Audric Estime, who found the end zone on Thursday night. So Nate, is the usage good enough for Estime to be a potential starting option here in Week 17?
Yeah, so on Thursday, Julio McLaughlin was inactive due to an injury that led to a little bit more playing time by Estime. It wasn't a ton more playing time. They still kept it as a three-man backfield, as frustrating as that can be, but we have seen Estime get at least 5 or so carries in most of the games over the past 2 months. So he is on this list mostly because I wanted some players who are available in at least 90% of ESPN leagues, and everyone else that we've talked about who's available in at least 90% of ESPN leagues is dependent on 2 other running backs being injured. So Estime is on here if you're in one of these deeper leagues, for whatever reason, desperate for a running back, and all of these other options we're talking about are not available. If you just need someone that can score you a couple of points this week, he is the guy, but hopefully you are not in that situation where you need Estime in your starting lineup.
For sure. All right. I want to let everybody know that this show is sponsored by Fabric by Gerber Life. The new year is a great time to reevaluate financial goals, not just for yourself, but for your kids. Now is the perfect time to make sure your kids are on a path toward a solid financial future. A kid's investment account from Fabric by Gerber Life is quick and simple to set up and lets you invest in their future now for education, big milestones, and more. Fabric by Gerber Life was designed by parents for parents to make it easy to plan for and manage your family's financial path. With a kid's investment account from Fabric, you can start investing in your child's future today. Kids can't invest when they're minors, but a kid's investment account allows you to invest on their behalf now, giving their investments more time to grow. It's all online, and setting up an account could take you just 5 minutes. Then you can manage your child's account and monitor their investments right from your phone. Funds can be used for nearly anything, benefiting your child from tuition and tutors to music classes. And when they're adults and out on their own, they can use the funds for anything they need. Join the thousands of parents who trust Fabric to help protect their family. Start investing in your child today at meetfabric.com/fantasy. That's meetfabric.com/fantasy, meetfabric.com/fantasy. Portfolios managed by Fort Washington Investment Advisors, Inc. Additional services provided by Apex Clearing Corporation, and all investing is subject to risk. Learn more at meetfabric.com. Okay. A duo of Packers wide receivers are up next with Romeo Doubs and Dontavian Wicks leading the way for our waiver wire wide receivers this week, coming off a Monday Night Football game where Wicks at least found the end zone, but the Packers offense, I mean, they really didn't need to do much at all in this game. So probably expecting a more competitive game here in week 17.
Yeah, Dobbs was at the top of the list before Monday Night Football, and I left him there, even though he had the quiet game. He's been the best wide receiver on the waiver wire in terms of production over the course of the season. And they are playing the Minnesota Vikings next week, a team where they will need to pass the ball a lot more, where, like you were saying last night, they had 3 drives, 3 touchdowns, mostly giving the ball to Josh Jacobs every play with a big play by Tucker Kraft mixed in. And that's all they needed to get the victory, and it was kind of game over at that point. So Dobbs was getting rotated out by the third quarter. Even Jacobs was getting rotated out by the third drive. So definitely a weird game by the Packers, but going up against the Minnesota Vikings, both teams fighting for playoff position, should be a very fun game, a competitive game. The NFL flexed it to the later time slot on Sunday as well because they want more people watching it. So the Vikings have allowed a ton of fantasy points to wide receivers this season, have allowed at least 170 receiving yards to wide receivers in 5 of their past 6 games, have allowed 17 touchdowns to wide receivers in the last 12 games. So it should be a big game by the Packers wide receivers in general. And then we saw Christian Watson suffer an injury last night. A player fell on his leg, basically. Was able to return for later in the second quarter, a little bit to start the third quarter. But we did see his leg getting worked on again in the middle of the third quarter. The team officially ruled him questionable, so it seemed like he re-aggravated the injury at some point there. But it was also a point in the game where the Packers were up by multiple scores, already starting to rotate out their other players, including Jacobs and Dobbs and Kraft. So it's a point in the game where I would have expected Watson to stop playing anyway. So that means I'm not exactly sure the extent of the injury right now. So there is a chance that Dontavian Wicks would be the starter if Christian Watson is out. Wicks has been the starter anytime one of these other wide receivers has been injured, and Wicks available in over 90% of leagues. So again, a great matchup against the Minnesota Vikings where, one of these wide receivers probably won't have a big game, including Jaden Reed in there, who's not available on the waiver wire. But at least I would expect 2 of these 3 wide receivers to have the big week against Minnesota.
Nice. All right. So Rashad Bateman is apparently the favorite end zone target of Lamar Jackson these days, and he's delivered. He's looked good with 5 touchdowns over his last 6 games, giving him 8 on the year. So clearly a big part of the offense, Nate.
At this point, a lot of the wide receivers I'm probably not trusting in my fantasy lineups in most leagues. If you got to a fantasy championship, you're probably using the wide receivers that got you there. We haven't really seen many injuries to wide receivers recently. So a lot of these guys are just, if you are in a deeper league, a lot of them in particular as well, if you are underdogs in your fantasy championship round, these are the guys that I think are most likely to kind of have a big spike week. Might not do very much in the game as well, but because you're the underdog, you might need someone who has a higher touchdown potential. And Bateman is the first one of those players on this list. Has scored a couple times in the past few weeks, faces the Houston Texans, who has allowed the 8th most fantasy points to wide receivers. I know Bateman didn't have a big game last week, but the Steelers are a good team against wide receivers. So a very different matchup. The Texans also a team who have allowed a lot of deep touchdowns this season. So that's a big part of this as well, as Bateman is that kind of classic high average depth of target, low target share player you typically don't want in your fantasy starting lineup. But in a week like this where you need the win no matter what, Bateman has a chance to score a touchdown. We saw him score 2 touchdowns the week before. So we could see another big game out of Bateman.
For sure. Yeah. And, speaking of more of those guys that have the potential to find the end zone here, we got the rookie wide receiver for the Bucs, Jalen McMillan. He looked great on Sunday Night Football. Again, he's been kind of heating up recently. He has, I think, 4 touchdowns in his last 3 games and probably could have had another one this past week, if not for a great play by the Cowboys corner, Jordan Lewis, to kind of rip it away from him as they were falling to the ground. So McMillan is a nice option for those in need this week as well, Nate.
Oh yeah, has really stepped up, not just the touchdowns, but his target share these past 3 weeks has been catching a lot more passes. Kate Otten injured, didn't play last week, so that also somewhat contributed. Sterling Shepard also dealing with injuries, so a little of it is by default. McMillan's a clear number two passing option outside of Mike Evans. I think if this wasn't the last week of the season and it wasn't so dependent on matchups, McMillan would probably at least be second on this list, maybe even first. But because there's just the 1 week left, I like Bateman's matchup better, but McMillan going up against the Carolina Panthers. Probably my big concern is that the Buccaneers will end up running the ball a lot more this week. And they've kind of had matchups recently where they've had to pass the ball a little more. But I think McMillan should be at least good for a couple of catches. And since he's been scoring so many touchdowns recently, also have the chance of scoring a touchdown.
For sure. Okay, Nate, we're back to Washington, looking for a potential wide receiver 2 here for Jaden Daniels to throw to. It was Noah Brown previously, but he's on IR now, so it appears that Olamide Zaccheaus has taken over that role here to close out the season.
Yes, another player available in 99.9% of ESPN leagues. So if you are in one of these deeper leagues, I think he is the best option to go after. He is someone who kind of started the season as an outside receiver after they added Noah Brown. That kind of took away his playing time, but he gained a role in the slot, eventually overtook Luke McCaffrey as the primary slot receiver. And then recently we saw Noah Brown go on injured reserve, and then Jamison Crowder return. Crowder also a slot receiver. So Zaccheaus played both on the outside and on the inside this week, seeing a pretty significant increase in playing time, having a good week, catching 5 passes for 70 yards and 2 touchdowns. If you're into the revenge game narrative, it was a revenge game for him this past week, going up against the Philadelphia Eagles, the team he played for last year. This week he plays the Atlanta Falcons, the team he started his career with, and the Falcons are a team that have allowed a decent amount of fantasy points to wide receivers. So I think he is someone who could have another decent game. The number 2 wide receiver for Washington has had a decent floor this season, and we saw him score the touchdowns this week. So there is the opportunity for him to have a big game as well.
For sure. Okay, speaking of teams in need of a wide receiver 2 to step up, the Pittsburgh Steelers may have found someone to help opposite George Pickens, as Calvin Austin has posted back-to-back games of 65 receiving yards. So how are you feeling about Austin for the Steelers, Nate?
I'm feeling good about him in general, just that he has stepped things up recently with George Pickens out. He had been a slot receiver throughout the start of the season. If anything, his playing time was slowly but surely on the decline, with Ben Skoranek rotating with him in the slot. But with Pickens out, Austin has started to play more on the outside as well as playing in the slot. 2 straight games where he's got 65 yards, a couple catches in there. So he's had some decent fantasy performances. My only concern is that Pickens was listed as a full participant of practice on Monday. So a pretty decent chance it looks like that Pickens will return. Because of that, I'm probably not trusting Austin too much. I think he'll still see a pretty significant amount of playing time. Going up against the Kansas City Chiefs, a team that Pittsburgh will need to pass the ball a lot, so there should be a decent amount of volume to go around. It's just unclear if Austin will be able to take advantage of that matchup or not. So probably not someone I'm trusting in a lot of leagues, but again, someone available in a ton of leagues. So if the first couple guys we talked about aren't available, and it's one of these deeper leagues where it's like 14 plus players in the league, or you're starting 4 or 5 wide receivers, then Austin is someone to start considering.
All right. And then last but not least, as far as I'm concerned, Jalen Coker of the Carolina Panthers. He only had 2 catches for 8 yards this week, but he had a sick one-handed catch in the back corner of the end zone. It just, he didn't get both feet down. So he just continues to highlight his talent. Nate has a chance to break through here on any given week.
Yeah, someone who had been the slot receiver for Carolina recently moved to the outside with Adam Thielen playing in the slot. So he is someone who has graded very well given his opportunities. So we believe he has a bright future. My only concern is he has only caught at most 4 passes in a game. And at this point are looking for someone who can have a potential big game. We think he has the talent to get there, but we just haven't seen it quite yet, where some of these other guys on the list we have seen have bigger games over the past week or two.
Yeah, very understandable. Okay, tight ends are up next, and we'll start with a player that I wish I had started at least one league this week, because Chig Okonkwo had an excellent performance. It included 11 targets, 9 catches, 81 yards, and a 2-point convert. So, Nate, the playing time has been the concern for Chig, but we did get an increase this week.
Yeah, it was both the playing time as well as the target share. He was seeing not many targets throughout the season. Last week, he did have a fairly big game. 2 or 3 weeks before that, caught a 70-yard touchdown pass. So it seemed like things had started to turn around. The only reason we weren't as excited about him coming into this week is we saw Josh Wiley get a lot of catches late in the game once Mason Rudolph became the quarterback. So I was a little worried that Rudolph being a backup, Wiley being a backup, maybe had a lot more chemistry from practice. So we thought that could have been a factor in this game. But the Titans continued to throw to the tight ends a lot this week, like they did last week. And this time it was all Okonkwo getting a ton of catches. So this has been by far the best 2-game stretch of his career. He saw more playing time in this game than he has seen in any other game in his career. So definitely building some momentum going into both this week and next year. And he's facing the Jacksonville Jaguars, which is a relatively favorable matchup. They did play Jacksonville a couple weeks ago, and he didn't do very much in that game, but he has been getting a lot more targets and a lot more catches since that point. So if you are in need of a tight end off the waiver wire, then Okonkwo, I think, is the clear top option.
Yeah, always an intriguing name. I'll be interested to see what he can do next year, because, yeah, he's got some potential and talent. So it would be nice to see him be involved a little bit more. So our other tight end option is Dalton Schultz of the Houston Texans. And the Texans are in need of another receiving option, even more now with Tank Dell done for the year. He's joining Stephon Diggs. So Schultz has been stepping up recently and has a good shot to do so in week 17.
Yeah, has had the playing time all season, just hadn't really done much most of the year, but 2 of the past 3 games, he's caught at least 5 passes for at least 45 yards and a touchdown. So he has been getting more involved. And like you said, with Tank Dell's injury, that just increases the chances that Schultz is a bigger part of this passing game this week, going up against the Baltimore Ravens, a team that has a lot of passing yards. It was a lot of it early in the season. The Ravens defense has gotten a bit better over the second half of the season, but it's just a case where Schultz should be potentially the second receiving option in the offense. John Mechie, also someone who was injured and didn't play last week, so that could have also contributed to Schultz getting more targets. So I think he is another option that if you just need kind of a safe floor player, Schultz can be in your lineup.
Absolutely. Okay, we've got 2 quarterbacks, and then we'll get to a couple questions here. But our final quarterbacks to wrap up this week, both actually number 1 overall picks in their respective drafts. And we'll start with the 2024 first overall pick, Caleb Williams of the Chicago Bears. What do you like about Williams' potential in week 17, Nate?
So we have seen a lot of games recently where the Bears just kind of fall behind. So Williams is passing the ball a lot. Williams playing decently well, at least for a rookie quarterback. So that's led to a ton of fantasy production recently. He completed 26 of 40 last week, 334 yards, 2 touchdowns. He was also running the ball a bit. He was someone who graded well as a runner in college. So seeing him run the ball a bit in the NFL is also nice. He had that stretch of games in late October, early November where he wasn't throwing touchdowns, but he's thrown at least 2 touchdowns in 4 of his last 5 games. So really a lot of the times the barrier between what's a top 12 fantasy quarterback and not a top 12 fantasy quarterback in any given week is who ends up getting multiple touchdowns and who does not. So Bears are facing the Seattle Seahawks on Thursday Night Football. We just saw Sam Darnold throw 3 touchdowns against them last week. Quarterbacks are consistently throwing 200 yards against them. Quarterbacks have thrown 2 touchdowns in 9 of the last 12 games against Seattle. The only problem here is a lot of the teams that might be looking for a quarterback this week are teams that have Jalen Hurts. And because the Bears play earlier in the week, we probably won't know Jalen Hurts' status for this upcoming week. until after Williams' game is played. So I think Williams is probably more so for teams that have been streaming quarterbacks or just kind of rotating who's your starter based on who's the best matchup. There is a chance that Williams is going to be a better player than some of those quarterbacks who have been starting in leagues the past couple weeks, just not better than the top quarterbacks in the league.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. And then the 2023 first overall pick, Bryce Young, is the other option off waivers. Nate continues to play so much better here recently, and hopefully he could keep it going for one more week now.
Yeah, he's someone who has been on this list for a long time because he was playing the Buccaneers the final week of the fantasy season. We saw him have a huge week against Tampa Bay in week 13, 23.6 PPR points. And then that was helped with him having a big game this past week, was running the ball a lot, which was nice. But first game, I think, with 3 touchdowns this season. So Young, not just going up in a great matchup, but is building momentum based on how well he played last week and has been slowly but surely playing better throughout the year too. So I think he can have another big week against Tampa Bay like we've seen plenty of quarterbacks have against Tampa Bay this season.
Absolutely. Okay. We got a couple questions here. First one from Mohal. It's a quarterback question. He lost Hurts. Is Kenny Pickett a better choice than guys like Russell Wilson, Bryce Young, or Michael Penix, do you think?
I'd probably go with Young for the reasons that we just talked about. I think Pickett can have a fine game, but I think they will probably run the ball a lot this week. If Pickett ends up being the starter, going up against Dallas, so a team where they should be able to get a decent sized lead just by handing the ball off over and over, especially if they're considering trying to get Saquon Barkley the record as well. This will be a good week for Barkley to get a lot of rushing yards too. So I think Pickett is fine if you are in one of these deeper leagues and there's not many quarterbacks available on the waiver wire. Then I think Pickett is a fine player to just throw in place of Hurts if he doesn't play. But if you have the option of some of these or other quarterbacks, I would probably go with Young, at least of those 3.
Yeah. And like you said, going with Young as well, like it gives you the opportunity to kind of wait on Jalen Hurts' status instead of going for like a Russell Wilson who's playing on Wednesday, right? So earlier in the week. And, if Hurts does get cleared, then obviously you could put him back in, but just gives you a little bit more time as well. So then Denver asks a question in relation to the running backs. Does Gus Edwards project better than the waiver wire targets that we talked about today? So Kendra Miller, Tajay Spears were at the top of the list. I know that the Chargers activated J.K. Dobbins as well. So how are you feeling about Gus Edwards in relation to these running backs this week?
Yeah, so Dobbins, they opened up the practice window, so that doesn't necessarily mean Dobbins will play this week. We have seen cases where a practice window is open and the player is activated right away. We've also seen cases where they are activated, but they give it some time. And with the Chargers pretty well set for the playoffs, but not necessarily playing for that much better of a seed, I wouldn't be surprised if they wait a little bit. So I think Edwards is a fine waiver wire target. I would probably put him at the top of the list. The only thing is, like, if some of the scenarios play out, like if Tony Pollard doesn't play, then Tajay Spears would be the best running back of all of them, or things like that. So a good matchup going up against the New England Patriots. I know Vidal was getting more involved, but we were consistently seeing Edwards still leading the team in carries, and in a game where they should be able to run the ball a lot. Don't know what the weather forecast is going to be this week in New England, but it could be a game where weather is a factor, where if it's colder, they might run the ball more. If it's snowing, they might run the ball more. So I think Edwards is someone who could have a pretty decent game this week. Just someone who is not available in 50% of ESPN leagues, so was not talked about on this list.
For sure. All right, that is going to do it for us this week and for the season, at least for the Waiver Wire show. Hopefully you guys finish the season with the championship now. And I want to say thank you to everyone for tuning in all season long. And Nate, thank you to you as always. It's been a busy and long season, but was happy to do the show with you every week. And hopefully the good folks win their leagues. So thank you and happy holidays to you, sir.
Yes, happy holidays to you as well, and thank you for putting a lot of this together as well. You're the one putting the graphics slides on this every week, so you've been taking care of that. You've been taking care of the ad reads, making my life easy of just having to remember what I wrote about in the article. So thank you for that, and after you've enjoyed listening to us all season long, luckily we will be back throughout the off season as well. We'll be having at least a weekly show throughout the off season, so you will get to hear us talk a lot about 2025 and free agency and the draft and all that fun things over these next couple months.
Yeah, looking forward to it. It's going to be a fun off season as always. And then I will be back for one more fantasy season podcast. I'm recording the IDP preview show to maybe this afternoon, tonight, to help our lovers of the defensive side of the ball as well. So we'll see you then. Otherwise, Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, and most importantly, good luck in the fantasy finals. Thank you all. And until next time, peace out.